we're ready to go ahead and get started. So thank you so much for coming to our workshop, the Lomita District Formation Workshop this morning. We're so glad you're here. Just as an FYI, this meeting is being recorded, so you can see that is so you can go back and reference this in the future if you want to re-listen to anything. And then also it will be posted to the website, lomitacity.com/districting for folks who are unable to. We also do have Spanish interpretation available today, so if there was anyone here who required that, it would be available. I think that we do not require that at the moment. All right. Next, moving into introductions, Twig. I am a principal of the Trippepi Smith. We are helping Lomita communicate this important issue. We also have Luis Verdin as part of the Trippepi Smith team, as well as our videographers. And then we also have Andrew Westall, the demographer, who is running the process for the city of Lomita. Andrew, is there anything you'd like to share as way of an additional introduction?
No, we just hope you enjoy the maps, and if you don't, please let us know too.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll be turning it over to you shortly. And then coming in and out, we do have City Manager Ryan Smoot with us today, and he'll be available to answer any city-specific questions that may come up as we move forward. Speaking of. So City Manager Smoot, before we jump in, was there anything that you wanted to share as far as remarks?
No.
Okay. Perfect. Here are some of our goals for our session today. So first, we do want to have this be an opportunity for you to learn from the experts. Today, that's primarily Andrew as the demography expert who will be walking you through background on the process, why it's so important, and also sharing the draft maps that have been submitted and sharing more about the online mapping tools. And then next, once you've heard from the experts, it's probably even more so important that we, the experts with the city and with the demography team, hear from you, because you are the experts on Lomita, the experts on your community, and all of that will factor into how the district lines are drawn. As you mentioned, we will be presenting the draft maps that have been shared to date. So there are 3 draft maps that have been developed by the demographer. Those are on the website and also posted on the wall there. We'll be walking through those. And then also going into a demonstration of the online mapping tool. So if you haven't submitted a map already, you'll be more prepared and equipped to do that after today's workshop. And then lastly, we want you to feel empowered leaving today's workshop to participate in the process moving forward, to go ahead and share feedback on maps or submit revised draft maps if you haven't done so already. So those are our goals. Next, we want to make sure we emphasize why you should care. So this is process, and fundamentally we just know that democracy works better when you, the citizens of Lomita, are engaged. And as we mentioned, experts on Lomita and on the community, so that is an important part of the process overall and why it's important to you as residents. Lastly, districting and redistricting in general is a once-in-a-decade opportunity, so it's critical for residents to get involved when it happens. And then obviously for Lomita, this is the first time it's happening for you, so it's really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get involved and have a voice in your community. I know we've already jumped in and we're running just a tad behind schedule, but this is for today. Andrew will be the process, legal criteria and goals. Then we will get into a discussion of the draft maps, go through that mapping tool demo, and lastly, we'll cover next steps. So that brings me to turning it over to Andrew for the demography expertise. And Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Jen. Good morning. As Jen said, my name is Andrew Westall. I'm a principal at Bear Demographics and Research. I'm the demographer that was hired by the city for this project. And so any of the maps or data that we produced, we can certainly answer any questions on. In general, we want to take you a little bit through the process and the criteria that we have to use to actually draw the maps. So the first of all is, why are we going to council district-based elections, right? Well, under a district-based election system, the way that it works is currently the city is at large. And what that means is when you go to vote, you vote for, depending on the year, right? You either have 3 council members or 2 council members that you're voting for on the ballot. Under this scenario, the city would be equally divided into 5 districts. And then once again, you'd have 3 council districts that would come up in one year, and then you'd have another 2 council districts in another year. The way that this works is instead of just living in the city of Lomita when you want to run for city council, you actually have to live within that particular district in which the election is coming up. And so many of the jurisdictions that surround Lomita do have district elections, and this is something that the city is going through for the first time. So why is the city doing this? Well, the reason that the city is doing this is because the city received a letter last year, in January of last year, challenging the city's current election system. And there's a law called the California Voting Rights Act, which has the potential to create liability for the city if they don't go to district elections. And so, in light of that, the city decided that the best thing to do was to look at transitioning to a district-based elections. A lot of that has to do with legal liability under this law, under the California Voting Rights Act. In general, why does it matter? Well, district formation, the goal really is to bring neighborhoods and communities and group them together into a district for purposes of electing a council member. This process that we've been going through for several months now, as the mayor and the city council are seeking input from the public into what that map should look like. In a little bit, we'll go through the 3 draft maps that we drew, but the public also submitted 11 maps as well. So there's a lot of different maps that you can look at for this process. An opportunity to share with the mayor and the city council what you think these boundaries should look like and how they should be drawn for the community. The city council will be meeting on Tuesday, right? Tuesday evening at 6:30 will be the next public hearing on this process, in which the council will have the first time to discuss the draft maps. And so it's really important that the public lets the city council and the mayor know how they feel about these maps, or what changes they would like to make, or if you have other maps that you want to submit, you can do that as well. Yeah, so the city council meetings start at 6 traditionally. The reason that this is scheduled for 6:30 is because it's a public hearing that has to be noticed for a specific time. And so if you show up at 6, we won't get to this item for about half an hour, but it will come up about 6:30. So that's in general the process and why we're doing this. The next thing that you really want to understand is what is the criteria you have to take into consideration when drawing these maps. The first one is what's called the equal population principle. And that's the idea that each of these 5 districts should be equal in terms of its population. The population numbers that we use are based on the 2020 census. It's the last census that we have had. And so those are the numbers that we use in general. When it comes to the equal population principle and it comes to local districts like the city of Lomita, you do have some flexibility. And what I mean by that is when you're drawing new congressional districts, every congressional district has to be within 1 person of each other. But when it comes to local districts, like city council districts, you have some flexibility of up to what's called 10% of the overall deviation. And when we get to the numbers of the draft maps, I'll explain that a little bit more. But the idea is that they don't have to be exactly equal in population, but you can have a bit of a range. But if you do have a range, you have to be able to describe that on this other traditional redistricting criteria, which we'll get to at the end of this slide. So that's the first thing we think about, is we want to equalize the population among the districts every time we do this process. The second thing, or the second and third things that we look at, is how do you use race and ethnicity in this process? And there's 2 real main areas of law that deal with race and ethnicity when it comes to redistricting. The first one is the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which provides equal protection for everybody regardless of any characteristics they may have. The second area of law is called the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And under these 2 areas of law, really how we think about race and ethnicity in this process, and want to make sure that we're ensuring that minority voters have the ability to vote for candidates of their choice if you can create a district with a majority minority population. But you also want to make sure that you're not doing it in a way that harms other people in the city, right? And so certainly if you have more questions about that, I can get into more detail. But the idea here is that you want to you're trying to protect voters' rights, and if there's a large enough population of a particular ethnic group, you want to be able to ensure that they're being protected. Then lastly, we have what's called the traditional redistricting criteria. And the traditional redistricting criteria includes a number of different things. I think the next slide actually has a breakdown of it if we get to it. Yeah, there we go. So the traditional redistricting criteria is really outside of equal population as we're drawing these maps. These are really the main things that we want to think about. The first one is called contiguity. And that's the idea that when you're in a district, you should be able to travel to any other part of the district without having to leave the district. And so the city of Lomita is a contiguous city, right? It's one big rectangle, and so it's easy to draw contiguous. You also want to use existing boundaries. So you want to use street boundaries. You want to look at other geographic boundaries that you may have in the city. You can also look at political boundaries. So if you have overlapping school district boundaries or state legislative boundaries, you can consider those. But I think the city of Lomita is whole in all of those districts that I can recall. The next thing here, and this is really the most important thing to get information from the public, is really understanding what are the communities of interest in the city of Lomita. And this is really what we spend a lot of time doing, trying to figure out what the neighborhoods look like, the zoning map, kind of, the nice thing about Lomita is it's not very large, and so you can travel it pretty easily, but really trying to understand how the residents of the city of Lomita view themselves and view their neighborhoods. What school do your kids go to or your grandkids go to? Where do you shop? If you worship, where do you worship? Those sorts of things. So that we can get really an understanding of your viewpoint of how you view your city and those communities. And then lastly, the last criteria here is what's called compactness. And so this is the idea that districts should be geographically compact. Compactness is probably the most subjective of the criteria, and what I mean by that is depending on the geography of the city or the layout of the census blocks, compactness can mean different things to different people, right? So I think we've done a pretty decent job with the draft maps of drawing there are other ways to do it as well, as you can see with some of the public maps. So as I said, in general, what we're really trying to get from the public is how you define your community. What streets, what points of interest, what boundaries defined it. Does your neighborhood inside the city of Lomita have certain geographical boundaries that we should pay attention to? Is your area of Lomita similar to other parts of Lomita or not? And what do you feel are really your shared interests in your particular community? And as I said before, it's our job as demographers as we go through this process to try to protect communities of interest and sharing, preserving those communities that share those common interests that should be included in a single district in order to have effective and fair representation. There are a variety of things that we can look at also outside of points of interest. Housing patterns in the city. As I said before, we certainly looked at zoning patterns, public services, common culture or language or other things that we can take into consideration too. In terms of providing public input, there are really three different ways that you can provide public input in this process. The first one is what you're doing today, which is attending a hearing or a workshop. The second one is on our website at lomitacity.com/districting. We have a public comment form that you can fill out, and it goes directly to the city, and it also goes to us as well, so we can take those comments into consideration. And then if you'd like to draw your own map, and there's a mapping tool that you can use, and you can submit it to the email there at drawlomita@lomitacity.com. Turn it back over to Jen and see if you have any questions about the process and the criteria.
We do have another microphone here that we can bounce around to our participants if there are questions based on anything that's been shared so far. So are there any questions about the process or the background information that Andrew just shared?
This is, I guess, just trying to get some basic understanding. So I have several questions. One, are there ethnic pockets in the city of Lomita?
I'll be careful how I describe this because I'll describe it as plainly as I can. In general, there are some areas of the city which have larger concentrations of ethnic minorities than others. That being said, in general, the city is very is fairly spread out evenly. And what I mean by that is whether you're looking at the white population, the Asian population, or the Latino population in the city, which are the three large ones, right? They're pretty evenly spread out. There's certainly concentrations of Latinos in the kind of in the center of the city and in southern portions of the city. There's a large Asian population in the middle of the city and in the east of the city. And so there are different pockets here, but in general, as I said, it's basically evenly spread out. I mean, there's kind of a range, as you'll see in the numbers, but it's pretty evenly spread out. So that's in general what you have.
Okay, so then what I'm trying to understand is the value, and because I'm a member of the voters and I know they've studied this issue and they're
Yes.
a proponent of redistricting.
Yes.
Or districting.
Are you the one that submitted a map too?
I did.
Oh,
Um,
you were the first one too. Thank you.
I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah.
But now I'm trying to, as I thought about this process, that are we trying to make some populations, because they represent a certain area, able to elect representation so that that representation can speak at the council and have a stronger voice? Or are we trying to make all populations or all ethnic groups, all special interests, let's put it that way, represented in each district, so that every council person is representing in basically the whole city again?
Ryan, do you want to take the CVRA question, and then I can take the kind of the other liability questions?
Yes. So the answer is a little bit of both. So the general intent here is to ensure that the representation on the city council is reflective, or at least to the maximum extent possible, reflective of the community as a whole, right? And from the CVRA perspective, there's two things we can look at. Andrew mentioned some of the federal laws that are associated with the California Voting Rights Act. Okay. So Andrew mentioned some of the federal laws that are associated with districting, and there's also the California laws, and that is the California Voting Rights Act. Under federal law, there is a requirement to establish, if possible, a majority-minority district. In California's law, that requirement doesn't exist, and all that's needed to be shown is that there's racially polarized voting in some form, and so that's what triggers this whole process. So that's what we're trying to accomplish under California law. Under federal law, I think that there's probably some argument to be made that the city's representation meets all of those criteria. Under California law, there is an argument to be made that and that's what's been challenged in the letter we received, is that we're not complying with the California Voting Rights Act. In other words, when Andrew says that the population of Lomita is fairly well spread out, that's absolutely true. If you look at the numbers of all of the census blocks in the city, it's fairly homogeneous across the city, and fairly spread evenly. And it becomes very difficult in that circumstance to actually draw a district that creates a majority-minority district. So I don't think that that's, from the city's perspective, that's not necessarily the intent we're trying to do, is concentrate any particular group of minorities within a district or spread them across all districts. We're looking at it more holistically and saying, if we're going to do this as an entire city, and if the council is going to make this move, we want to ensure that the council over time is reflective of the community as a whole, not necessarily reflective within a particular district. Is that helpful?
Yes, but further on that.
Don't worry about the microphone if it doesn't work.
That's good. The mapping process led you to, the challenge seemed to be to make the districts equal in the ethnic populations, which was leading. if you're trying to get districts that are representative of certain groups. So that was one part. And then the other is that, to me, in the city of Lomita, the difference of interest is really between the residents and the businesses more than it is ethnically, because as I view it, it's more spread out than homogeneous throughout the city.
Yeah, I'll let Andrew jump in on some of this, but you're correct. The process does require that we look at those numbers and ensure that there is some level of equal representation, at least to the extent that we can, within those districts. But I think at the same time, you're absolutely correct that we did, in the maps that we considered and in maps that were submitted by the public, we did get some input that we should be looking at business districts as opposed to residential districts, or school areas where might be represented in this school area. So it wasn't necessarily wholly based around race or ethnicity populations. There was other communities of interest that were taken into consideration in this whole process as well. I think you're looking at it very well.
Okay. My point, though, is that what I just heard about the California voting rights, then we really should be looking at making districts that are heavier in certain ethnic groups so that they do have.
Yeah, I think actually Andrew can take this one. When we start going into the numbers of some of the maps, I think you'll see where we went.
Yeah. So in general, we don't use race. Excuse me. We don't use race and ethnicity to draw maps. What we use race and ethnicity to do is really test whether or not we're complying with federal and state law. And so as we draw maps, we go back and we look at the numbers and see if there's any liability under the Federal Voting Rights Act, particularly under Section 2. If you can, in general, what you want to look at is, can you draw a majority minority district in Lomita? The answer is no, you can't. There's no way to possibly draw a majority minority district in the city. You just can't get there. And as you'll see with the maps that we drew and the maps that were submitted by the public, none of them have a majority minority district because you physically can't do it. That doesn't mean you still don't have liability under the California Voting Rights Act in terms of racially polarized voting, and it's certainly, from a legal standpoint, better for the city to go to district elections. But once again, you can't draw, in this case, you can't draw a majority minority Latino or Asian district. You just can't do it. And so that's the bottom line. And so, as I said, we only use race and ethnicity to test those things. And so when we get into the discussion of the maps here in just a second, I'll go through a bit of an explanation of how we came to these maps and why we think they're good. I mean, you may not, but we can at least give you an explanation of how we came to those.
Any other questions? I'll hold this up just so we can catch it on the recording, if that's okay.
Agree with him that we can't divide the city up into ethnic areas because there's people everywhere that are of all races. And that's the hard part. You have one concentration of a heavy minority, and that's a very small area in our district. And it's our H housing up on Western Avenue. If you had to pick a ethnic group that lives there, would be Hispanic and black. And it used to be mostly black. I don't know what it is right now, but it mostly used to be African, American. And it would be hard to put that district by itself, because I did some maps myself in this process and thought about that, because my name's Henry Sanchez. So I'm Hispanic, even though I look like my mom. I look like my mom more than I do my dad. But but I happen to live close to that housing there, So when I was drawing my maps, I was trying to do it to include that and you just can't do it. Yeah. I mean, you can't get the population. It would be too small of a district compared to the rest as far as the population. And you just can't do it, And so when you guys, I'm looking at your maps over here, and boy, you divide the city up pretty good. And the three I did them trying to keep the geographical areas together, as much as possible, and still meet the criteria you guys had.
Yeah.
So it's really hard in our area to do that.
It is not, and the other one is that, I went with business versus residential. I went with business versus residential, and then after I submitted it, I thought, well, wait a minute. You have to live in that district to run in that district. How many business owners live behind their business? And so it's not really representative. And also in those districts, I would think there's a bit of a conflict between the business owners and the close by residents, especially the breweries. So, all of this, I'm just asking open questions because my brain is trying to deal with what is it that you're trying to get to have the best system for your residents to be represented by your council.
Trying to accomplish and trying to maintain, I think Lomita's done a very good job of in the past, has been that the city council views the community holistically. They see themselves as representing the whole community. One of the challenges when you go to districts is, well, that's not in my district, so it doesn't matter to me. And one of the challenges we face in that is mitigating that as much as possible. And so when we were looking at these and looking at the maps submitted, that's some of the things that we were keeping in mind, and some of the challenges that we see going forward from the city's administration in keeping our council members, regardless of what district they're in, focused on, even though it may not be in your district, it's important to the community and it still serves your district. If Lomita Park isn't necessarily in your district, your residents still go to Lomita Park. If our downtown isn't necessarily in your district, your residents still visit our downtown. So that's a challenge that I see that we're going to have to face in the future. And I think as we're drawing these maps, it's something that we can take into consideration. Maybe hypothetically, if you split the downtown and have it in two different districts, is there a benefit to that, and are there challenges associated with that? Of course there are. If we split commercial districts from residential districts, are there challenges with that? That you're absolutely correct. There are certainly challenges. And I think of all the maps submitted, I think the public did a great job in taking all of those things into consideration and really giving us some valuable input as we went through this process. So Andrew's challenge was to take all of that input, sort of aggregate it, and make something that took those main points out of those maps submitted by the public and make them something that we felt fits the legal criteria and that's defensible, but also still accomplishes what we're trying to accomplish. So that's where these three maps came from. They sort of aggregate all of that data into three options that we thought were feasible.
Would you like to go on to the draft maps? We could do that next.
Yeah, let's do that, Andrew.
Then we'll stop again for some questions. But it seems like a good segue. Okay. So in general, and you can see this on the wall as well, what the city asked us to do is to draw 3 draft maps to provide different options. In general, the way that we drew these maps was so forth. First off, what we did is we looked at all of the public submitted maps, and there was 11 maps that were submitted by the public. Both of you submitted maps, as well as a variety of other people. And so we looked at all of those, and they're all available on the website. And then also looked at kind of all the other maps, kind of test maps that I'd been drawing and kind of looking at different things. And even in the mapping demonstration that I did at the last workshop, there's a map that I drew there. And so kind of taking all of those things into consideration was the first thing that we did. The second thing we did is we really looked at the public facilities throughout the city, right? So where are the schools located? Where are the parks located? And really trying to make sure that there's an equitable distribution to the extent possible in the city of Lomita among those parks and schools. And so you'll notice that the 3 schools that are in the city are in different districts. I believe every district has a park, even if it's a pocket park. And so we try to take that into consideration as well. And then the last thing that we really looked at is really the commercial areas, the businesses versus residents that you were just talking about. And really looking at Narbonne in particular, PCH, and then also Lomita Boulevard. Really those three main streets, and making sure that there was adequate representation among those areas. So as you can see with this first draft map, you have PCH in 3 districts, you have Narbonne in 3 districts, and then you have Lomita in 2 districts. And so those were kind of the main kind of concepts that we utilized on these maps. The other thing that I'll say about the city of Lomita is the geography sometimes is difficult, which I'm sure each of you came across in drawing maps. There are certain areas of the city which have very, very long blocks, right? I mean, there's, when you're going between 250th and 255th in some places, you got to go down to 255th to turn around, right? To get around the block. You can't, there's stop in between. And so, that also sets a bunch of challenges in place. And then the other thing I'll say in general is you'll notice that some of these shapes come from some of the draft maps because they were just good ways to draw districts. And there's other ways or other districts, like particularly this district in the south. There's really only a couple of ways to draw it, as you'll see. And we tried to provide both ways to do that. You could cap it, as you'll see in draft map number 3, the orange district goes above PCH. You could cap it at PCH, but that really leaves a high deviation, right? So we'll talk about that too. So with this first draft map, which we tried, taking all of those things into consideration and coming up with these 5 districts. And then, as you can see over here, these are just the top line numbers, and there are more detailed numbers on other types of statistics that are available on the city's website and in the city staff report. But in general, there's a couple things here that you want to look at. So the first one is that equal population that we were talking about earlier. And as you can see, in this particular scenario, in draft map number 1, the red district has 169 more people than the ideal, and the orange district has 76 less people than the ideal. And as you can see in Lomita, because we only have just under 21,000 people, that makes a huge difference in terms of population equality. And when we're looking at population equality, what you want to do is you take the percentage of the highest district with the highest population. So the percentage here is 4% with the red district. And then you take the percentage with the least amount of population district here, negative 1.8%. And you add those two numbers together, right? And as you can see here in the total section, you have 5.8%. Well, as I was talking before, when we talk about population equality, the courts have decided that in local jurisdictions like Lomita, as long as that number is less than 10%, it's presumed to be legally valid, right? So we want to make sure that always when we're making that calculation, that this number up here is less than 10%. And so certainly in the maps that you submitted, that was the case, and all 3 of these maps, that's the case as well. And so as you can see in this map, you have a Latino population in the red district of 39%, right? It also happens to be one of the higher, but as you can see with the Asian population, it's pretty spread out, even though they're slightly larger in the yellow district that's here. So it gives you an idea, as we were talking about before, no matter how you split up the city, it's relatively homogeneous in terms of its population. Like I said, you kind of have a bit of a range, but it's not a very big range. So that's draft map number 1. So now we have draft map number 2. Draft map number 2, we tried to do something a little different, particularly on the west side of the city, because you could draw this one district right here, basically using Cypress as the main boundary. And so we wanted to show at least one version of it, which had a lot of the same concepts that I just talked about in the last map. The main difference here is under this particular map, you have 3 districts that touch Lomita Boulevard. You have a lot of the same characteristics as the other maps. The orange district in this map is exactly the same as draft number 1. And so, as I said, there's only so many shapes you can do down in that area. This one, like I said, is a little different. particularly with most of the west side of the city in one district. The total deviation in this map is 3.4%, right? So in terms of population equality, you're a little better off than you were in draft map number 1. With the district with the most population in this one being the yellow district at 1.6%, and the orange district is at negative 1.8. Then we have draft map number 3, which tried to take some of the concepts of draft map number 1 and then provide a different version of that orange district, right? As you can see in the first 2 draft maps, that orange district comes up, is it Eshelman? Comes up Eshelman for the most part, and then kind of goes up and around Veterans Park and over to the east. In this particular scenario, instead of using Eshelman, you move it over to Oak Street, right? And so you pick up a lot of apartments in this area. You kind of drop some of the population here on the east side of the school, and that's how you draw that orange district. In terms of this particular map, there's also some variations you can do of this. I like this one better, but another variation is you could actually have the red district go up close to Lomita Boulevard, and this whole section of the middle school in this area go in the blue district, and so it's kind of more of a rectangle. But based on where the school was and the population of the blue district, it seemed, to me at least, that the school was better off in the red district instead of the blue one. The other thing I'll point out is that the yellow district in this one is the same as in draft map number 1, right? So the yellow districts are the same. In terms of this map, it's kind of in between the other 2 in terms of population equality at 4.2%, with the red district having the largest population at 79 people over at 1.9%, and then the purple district in this case having the least amount of population, negative 2.3%. So with that, we wanted to stop again and pause and see if you had any questions or comments about the maps. We can certainly go back to any of the 3 slides, and the maps are on the wall as well. But not sure if you had any comments or anything that you want to say about the maps.
Yeah, and depending on your feedback, we are happy to take some notes. We can jot down any major observations on our whiteboard here. So if there's anything that is an observation about all 3 maps, we would welcome that. And like Andrew mentioned, we can flip back to each of the 3 maps and maybe gather any thoughts on each of them. So were there any thoughts that popped out as you were looking at each of the maps?
Have you in the past noticed or come up against any sense of inequality from the community toward council decisions?
Not in our discussions with the city, we haven't come up against any of that, but certainly if there's anything like that, it would be good to take it into consideration. I mean, in general, we can take into consideration just about everything, but as long as we're following the law and doing what we need to do for the process.
Okay, and there's one little note.
Mm-hmm.
I'd suggest that you on the mapping base,
Mm-hmm.
that you just make the major streets a little darker, because I think people recognize the city better if they can see the roads, the Lomita and PCH and Narbonne and Eshelman, a little darker, so that you can, the major ones.
Yeah, we should be able to do that. What I'll do is I'll recreate the JPEGs so we can put them as facing on the website, and then we'll use them in the presentation for Tuesday night.
Okay, and then I just have one other question. I think I know the answer. Isn't Lomita about the size of just one of the 5 districts in Torrance?
That's probably, well, Torrance is about 100,000, so that's
140,000.
Yeah. Oh, so Lomita is 21,000, so smaller.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So in a way, this is kind of academic, but it meets the law. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Lomita is closer to a recent jurisdiction where we did district elections was the city of Desert Hot Springs, which has about 22,000 or so.
You know, when you made these boundaries, I don't care which map it doesn't make a
Okay.
difference.
Sure.
You know, when I went on the website to do that myself, you know, it was either groups and boundaries. I think that were the two abilities I had. And I could only do certain things with it. Where I wanted to cut some streets, go into a street and make that my boundary, I was unable to. So maybe I'm doing something wrong when I'm making this map, because you're in different places and I couldn't do what you're doing.
So in general, you should be able to recreate the same map. And the reason I say so is because it's based on census geography, right? So whether it's this map or the mapping tool, and hopefully the demonstration website was down a little earlier. Hopefully it's back up so I can show it to you. But in general, what you have is you can use census blocks. And I think also in the on the mapping tool, you start with census block groups, and then you can break it down a little further. And so maybe you're just not toggling that properly. Yes.
I tried to go across that street, go across there to make one of my districts.
Yeah.
I couldn't do it.
Yeah, as I said before, there's some very interesting census geography in the city
So
of
it
Lomita.
was really weird. I was trying to,
Yeah.
and I thought,
And that this one up here wraps around that entire area.
right,
And so you have to choose it or not.
yeah.
In some places, and it really depends on the interest of the council. In some places, we do cut census blocks,
Okay.
but typically when we do that is where there's no population. So let's say if there's an entire industrial area on the north side of that, and you could find a clean line, that's where we would do it. But because it's hard to estimate the population if you're not the census.
I had some problems between the red what is this color on the bottom of the right?
The orange, yeah.
Is that orange?
Yeah.
Anyway, I didn't think I was, but anyway, there's some things that you're doing with your map that I felt like I tried to do some of those things, but I couldn't do it. And so I'm wondering if I'm doing something wrong on that page. Trying to make
The main thing is probably the toggling back and forth between census block and block groups, which, like I said, hopefully we can go over that here in a minute.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
That's all.
Sure. No, it's a great question because it's
Trying to make the map different than what I thought would have been not only geographical but for the people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I was on the council for 9 years.
Yes, that's what I heard.
And so for me, I was like you said earlier that I tried to do everything for everybody in the city. It wasn't just where I live, And I think districts now it's going to be more where I live, than thinking of you over by Pennsylvania, And so I'm going to want my streets done. I'm going to want things done in my district. That kind of thing. And to me, that divides us more than it brings us together. So that's my feeling because I've been in this place.
Yeah, it depends on the jurisdiction. Certainly, you can end up there in a decade or two pretty easily, right? Where it's very parochial. It really kind of it comes down to how you who you elect to office, right, and what the viewpoints are.
The administrative perspective, when we're designing projects and things, this doesn't even enter our process. This is really a political process for representation for the city council. It's a policy question. From an administrative question, this is not something we consider when we're designing projects. We never have, and frankly, I don't believe that we ever will. I would hope so, at least. Because that's just simply not how we do what we do. When we're designing street projects, we use our pavement management plan that assesses the condition of each individual street. And so we're looking at it more from that perspective than from the policy and representation perspective. So the projects that we're bringing forward obviously come from that perspective. Having said that, we did take into consideration in this process that the council has done a lot of work in the recent past on to do economic development within our downtown area, and so we have done a lot of work thinking about PCH. In our recent housing element, we've done a lot of work thinking about Lomita Boulevard and Narbonne, and in the last decade or so, there's been a lot of discussion about Narbonne and mixed use development and how that plays out. So we really wanted to ensure that as we're drawing these out, we're in some ways forcing our representatives to think about each of those things. That's why you see some of these districts touching a lot of those different areas that we know are big policy questions coming forth. That's not to say that we're designing projects that way. It's not to say we're designing zoning around these policy maps or designing these maps around zoning, but it's one of the many considerations that we do think about as we're presenting these things.
You make a very good point when you're thinking about drawing these maps, is that those citywide issues, as much as possible, should touch as many districts as possible, so that those representatives, and then you can hear me thinking, trying to understand all this, and I can see that there's something on both sides. And in this city, I don't think we've had it, but more and more, as the politics have changed in our country, there's power grabs, and this does at least prevent a power grab. So possibly. That could be a question too. Maybe it's good. I mean, I think it's a good concept. I'm not sure it was needed in Lomita because we are so small, but you got to do the best you can for governance.
All right. Well, great conversation on these draft maps. And as we mentioned, they are going to be presented and considered at the council meeting coming up on Tuesday. So more to follow. You can find them on the website, lomitacity.com/districting. So you're welcome to check them out there between now and then. But in the meantime, I think we can move on to some of our next slides. We did have the list of questions to consider for communities of interest if there were folks who hadn't reach that step in the process. I know both of you have submitted draft maps to the website already, so you've already probably considered those. So next on our agenda for today is the mapping tool demonstration. So we can go ahead and pull up the site, and the site was having some technical difficulties earlier today, so we'll give that a quick look. If not, we'll at least show you where to find it on the city's website.
It seems like it's still down.
Okay, so Andrew, I'll turn it over to you to share as much as is available for us today.
Sure. So in general, and you two are probably familiar with this, but for the public that's watching, every member of the public has the opportunity to draw a map or multiple maps that can be submitted for council consideration. As I mentioned earlier, we've had 11 maps that were submitted by the February 28th deadline for the public hearing. That's on Tuesday. And those maps have been labeled A through K, right? So those are also available for the public to view. But in order to draw your own map, you have a couple different things. On this particular page, which is page, when you click on this link on the sidebar here, you have the online mapping tool, which is called District Builder, and then you also have a startup guide. Why don't we try the mapping tool for a second? The mapping tool seems to be down for maintenance, which it still is. So why don't we just go to the guide there, Jen, and we can talk a little bit about it. In general, the last workshop that we had, which is available on the city's social media channels and the YouTube page, has an entire demonstration of the mapping tool. And so if you haven't seen that, I did about a 30-minute demonstration of the tool, which I can't do today. And so you can go back and look at that. But in general, this Getting Started guide will help you build a map, how you actually build your districts, looking at the metrics, selecting a different geo level, which I think is something that you'll be interested in, and then how the other tools work. So in general, you have to name your map, right? You pick a jurisdiction, and as you in District Builder, there is a City of Lomita organization page, and at that City of Lomita organization page is where you would go first to sign up, and then you can start to draw districts from there. And then you would hit this button called Create Map. So the first thing you do is once you log in, and if you haven't signed up, you have to sign up. And then at that point, you can create a map based on the Lomita, the geography of the city of Lomita. What you start with is a blank map. And so you start with a blank map, and then you can draw the 5 districts from there. This is in general what the tool looks like. On the right hand or the left hand of the page, you have the districts and the population. that you're trying to get, and on the middle of the page, what you would see is the actual map. You have different tools that you can use up at the top as well to select. And so you have a paintbrush tool, you have a pointer tool, I think there might even be a rectangle tool that you can use. So in general, what you would do is you go through and you select the different areas of geography for your particular district. And then once you've gotten to a certain point, when you've gotten that deviation to a point where it's within that legal limit, you'll see a checkbox here. And that checkbox will let you know that you at least hit the equal population. You can also review the metrics. And so after you've drawn a map, you can look at the population, the deviation. If you took your mouse and you hovered on this section of it, it would give you the ethnic breakdown of the district, and this gives you the majority-minority composition of the district. So as you can see here, what they're showing you is that you can also, as you're using your mouse, you can hover on top of a particular county in this respect, and it'll give you a breakdown of the ethnic population of that county. As we were talking about before, up here at the top of the map, obviously we don't have counties in our map because we're just one small portion of LA County, but it starts with block groups, which are much larger geography, and then you can always click on blocks, which is on the edge of the page here, and that'll give you a smaller geography that you can work with. So you can kind of go back and forth between block groups and blocks.
Yeah. That's what I'm talking, yeah, I was going back and forth between those.
Yeah.
But when I was trying to change my map to not go along with those particular boundaries they gave me.
Yeah, and if you, outside of those boundaries, it's stuck with the census geography, and so that's the geography that the census does. Yeah, and unfortunately, I mean, I can't speak for the city of Lomita because I wasn't familiar with the geography as much until we took this project on. But in general, because of the pandemic and because of the way that the Census Bureau had been run for several years leading up to the census, the geographic boundaries are not very good. And what I mean by that is there really should be more time spent on looking at what good geographic census blocks should look like.
I've lived in this district, area for 46 years. I've lived in my house for 46 years, so, and I have a lot of people I know in Lomita.
Yeah, and I'll say the census geography, this is the worst I've seen in 30 years in terms of this particular census.
I just know a lot of people, and I know ethnic, all different races, and so it's like, why can't I draw the boundaries myself? You know what I mean? I have to go along with what.
Well, yeah, there's
They put there.
you couldn't pull certain
Yeah,
streets
and,
into
so-
your area,
That was a hard
so
one for
you
me.
had to, you were forced to go, a certain way.
One of the things I think that would be helpful looking forward, and this is both for the city and the League of Women Voters, is typically the County of Los Angeles, every jurisdiction across the country, goes through a process, about a 2.5 year process to update their census geography prior to the next census. And so this is probably something the city of Lomita hasn't been too interested in yet up until this point because no one's really looked closely at the census block geography. But the city can actually have input with the county and request changes to the census block geography, which makes a little more sense for the city. So it's a process that you can go through and might be easier to go through this process again in 2031 when you go through it. So as we were talking here, just in terms of toggling back and forth between the different geographic levels. And then I think lastly here, instead of using the pointer tool or the paint tool, you can create a rectangle and touch a variety of census blocks or block groups to get your map as well.
Let me share something because I think it's important in this city, is that when we moved, I had 4 children, 2 very young, starting school, and I did not want to raise them in a biased population. And so we found Lomita accidentally, and the bigger houses, and I was looking at these, but I didn't want to move until I knew what the neighbors were.
I parked on the street near Lomita Magnet School, near the house we were considering, and I just watched children walk home. When I realized that they were a pretty mixed population, we bought the house because I wanted my children to not be raised with all that awful bias that people have to shake loose from later to get woke. So anyway, Lomita, that's why I treasure it, is because it seems homogenous to me.
Once you create your first district, as in this here, then go move on to the next district, you use that pointer button and you select on the next bar down, and you can see they don't do a very good job of highlighting it, but you can see it's actually in kind of a slight highlighted gray, and that'll let you know that you're working on next district as you're building it. And so then lastly, once you've actually selected geography for a particular area, you want to hit accept, and that will add it to that particular district. And once again, you just keep building your district until you get to that equal population deviation, right? So still a long ways to go in this particular example. So as I described earlier, we do have the entire mapping tool demonstration from the last workshop online. Certainly, if you have any questions, you can submit them to the Draw Lomita email. We'll be happy to answer them and get you any information that you need. But really appreciate both of you using that tool and providing those maps, because I think it's very helpful for the council to understand what their options are. And I think with the 11 public maps we have and the 3 draft maps, I think just about every shape that makes sense has been created. And so I think the council really has an idea of what the range of possibilities are. And as I said before, if you have any questions, just shoot us an email here at droplomita@lomitacity.com, and we'll get right on it and happy to get you any answers or any information you need.
And then next up in our agenda is actually to go over the website a little bit, so we can keep that website portal up in the browser. Luis, if that's okay. Just open up the Google browser again. Okay, and our team can just walk through what is on there really quickly. So the page that you're looking at now is the draw map page. So that's lomitacity.com/districting-draw-a-map. So kind of a mouthful, but where you want to go initially to find all this information is just lomitacity.com/districting. So if you'll just click on districting in Lomita, Luis. So this is really the landing page that will take you to everything that you need for the district formation process. You've hopefully been here to find the map drawing tools. So you can find the background, a lot of what we covered today in terms of why the city is doing this and what the process entails. You can also find the calendar of districting hearings and workshops. So that's another really important page that you may want to go back to and revisit to know the dates that are coming up next and everything to look forward to in the process. Here you'll also find a lot of the materials associated with each event. So we'll be posting public hearing notices, flyers, the agenda, staff report, the presentations and such for each of the events. So this is actually where you'll find the recording of that first virtual workshop, and you can watch the actual recording of the online mapping tool demonstration that Andrew had mentioned. And the recording for today's workshop will be there afterwards as well. So this is a really handy resource to not only situate yourself in the timeline of the overall process, but find a bunch of those resources that'll be important to use moving forward. And then next from these pages, if we navigate back up to the menu bars on the right, the draw a map page, which is what we went over earlier and what you probably use to draw your map. So people can continue to use that. There will be a second deadline for people to submit additional maps that might just be a little bit revised or based upon feedback that might come up at the March 21st hearing. So we'll be publicizing that later due date, and people might want to submit an additional revised map at that time through this page. So we've already covered this page, and then on the proposed maps page, here is where you'll find the draft maps that Andrew shared earlier today. So those 3 draft maps that were developed by Andrew based on the demography expertise and all the inputs from the community so far. And then you'll also see the 11 public submissions that were really factored in to create those overarching. So there those are there for your future reference, and we'll be posting any additional maps received later on in the process to that same page. And then back up to the navigation. We do have districting FAQs, so I won't review all of those, but those are available to hopefully answer some common questions that you might have about the process. And then just a few final tabs there. Districting resources include some helpful background information as well as news about Lomita's process. And then lastly, you can visit the districting contact page if you forget or need additional information on how to reach out about the process. So you can find an online form to easily submit your information, and the email address there, drawlamita@lomitacity.com, or the city's phone number. So lots of ways to find information, get the resources that you need, and get involved in the process. So that's a walkthrough of the website. And then I think from here, we can jump back to the PowerPoint, the upcoming deadlines that are coming up. So as we mentioned, March 21st on Tuesday, that'll be the third public hearing where City Council will consider these draft maps that have been discussed today. And then from there, there's that second deadline to submit maps that might be revised maps or tweaked slightly based on feedback that you might have heard. And those updated maps that might be submitted, those will be considered at the fourth public hearing. And that deadline to submit additional maps is April 4th. And then April 11th, those proposed maps that might come in that are revised or new, those would be posted on the website on that date. And then next up in the process would be April 18th, the fourth hearing, where City Council would, if all goes according to plan, select their final map. And you can find all those dates, like we mentioned, on the website, lomitacity.com/districting, and on the calendar page. And so with that, I know we just went over a lot of great ways where you can stay involved and continue participating in the process. You can always reach out by phone at 310-325-7110. You can email drawlamita@lomitacity.com, and you can visit that website we've been discussing, lomitacity.com/districting. So unless there are any final questions, that concludes our workshop today. So thank you again so much for coming.